I've been on the road for over 20 years. I've seen it all. Long stretches of empty highway, the occasional accident, strange characters in the dead of night. Driving a rig across the country, you get used to the loneliness, the rhythm of the engine humming beneath you, and the miles ticking away. But there's one night, one stretch of road that still keeps me up sometimes. No matter how many times I try to forget it, it creeps back into my mind, especially when I find myself alone in the dark, with nothing but the road ahead and my thoughts. It was around 3 in the morning, one of those graveyard shifts where the highway stretches out forever, and you haven't seen another vehicle for what feels like hours. I was hauling a load through northern Arizona, along a highway that cuts through the desert, one of those isolated roads where the only light comes from your own headlights. That night, the weather had taken a nasty turn. A storm had rolled in fast, the rain coming down in sheets. The wipers on my truck were working overtime, but the visibility was next to nothing. The fog didn't help, rolling in like a thick blanket, making the desert look like something out of a dream, a bad one. Normally, I'm comfortable in those conditions. I've driven through every kind of weather you can imagine, but that night, something felt off. It was a gnawing feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be out there, like I was trespassing on some forgotten piece of land. I chalked it up to the weather at first. After all, driving in the middle of a storm on an empty road in the dead of night, anyone would feel uneasy. I turned the radio up to cut through the tension, but the static hissed through the speakers. No stations out there, no signals. Just me and the sound of rain hammering the roof of the cab. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, through the fog, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't moving, just standing there. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt as the truck skidded. My rig lurched forward, and I fought to keep it steady, the wheels straining under my grip. For a split second, I saw them clearly. Someone or something dressed in white. A person? Couldn't have been. They didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react, nothing. I braced myself for impact, certain I was about to hit them. But then, just like that, they were gone. Vanished into the fog. I felt the truck slam into the side of the road, the wheels slipping on the wet dirt, and everything spun out of control. The world flipped. Metal screamed, glass shattered. I remember the crushing sound as the cab rolled, then darkness. When I came to, I was still inside the cab, upside down, strapped into my seat. My head throbbed, blood trickled down my face, and every muscle in my body screamed in pain. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and through the shattered windshield, I could see nothing but black sky and the faint glow of my truck's hazard lights reflecting off the wet road. I coughed, tasting blood, and tried to move. My legs were pinned under the dashboard. It took me a minute to understand that I was alive. I had survived the crash. But that wasn't the worst part. I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense, a feeling, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just shock or paranoia. But then I saw them. Figures, standing just outside the range of the headlights. Dark shapes, barely visible through the fog, but unmistakably there. I couldn't see their faces, just their outlines, like shadows in the mist. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. I tried to call out, my voice hoarse. No response. They stayed still, almost blending into the fog, as if they weren't really there at all. I fumbled for my phone, but of course, it was smashed in the wreck. I was stuck, injured, alone, and those things, whatever they were, weren't going anywhere. I must have passed out again because the next thing I remember is the sound of sirens and the flash of blue lights. EMTs pulled me from the wreckage, loaded me into an ambulance, and rushed me to the nearest hospital. I tried to tell them about the figures on the road, about the person I had seen, but they chalked it up to a head injury, the shock of the crash. No one believed me. I spent a week in the hospital, recovering from a broken leg, a concussion, and a few cracked ribs. During that time, I had nightmares, visions of that figure standing in the road, of the dark shapes in the fog. It wasn't just the accident replaying in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, closer, clearer. Then, something strange happened. One of the nurses, an older woman who had been working at the hospital for years, overheard me talking to a doctor about the crash. When he left the room, she pulled up a chair next to my bed. "You said it was Highway 191, right?" she asked. I nodded, confused. "I've heard stories about that stretch of road," she said quietly. "It's known for accidents, fatal ones. The people who've died there, some say they never left." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. "There's been a lot of crashes on that highway over the years," she went on. "Most of them happen at night, in bad weather, just like yours. People say they see things, figures, shadows, just like you did, and then they crash. Sometimes they survive, like you. Sometimes they don't." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She gave me a sad smile. "I'm saying you're not the first to see them, and you won't be the last." I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just a story, but deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever I had seen on that road wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't just a freak accident. A few days after I was discharged, I drove back out to that stretch of highway. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But as I passed the spot where the accident had happened, I felt it again, that gnawing sense of unease. And for just a second, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something in the fog. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I haven't driven that stretch of Highway 191 since, and I don't plan to. My name is Dave Harper, and this story happened during a cross-country trip in the summer of 2010. I was driving my RV along Route 22, heading toward a small town in northern Colorado. It was supposed to be a peaceful road trip, a way to clear my head after a tough few months at work. The open road always gave me a sense of freedom, and I thought I'd be able to forget my troubles for a while. Little did I know, that trip would become the most terrifying experience of my life. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun had just begun to set, when I spotted an old station wagon pulled over on the side of the road. The hood was up, and an older man was standing next to it, waving frantically for help. At first, I thought about driving past. Something about it didn't feel right. But against my better judgment, I decided to pull over and offer assistance. After all, I had some basic tools and enough experience to help someone in a pinch. The man looked relieved as I approached. He introduced himself as Frank and claimed to have been stuck there for hours after his car overheated. I offered to give him a lift to the nearest town, and he gratefully accepted. As we continued on, the scenery grew darker, and the road stretched endlessly through the barren plains. That's when I noticed something odd. Another car was trailing us, its headlights barely visible in the fading light. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another traveler. But as time went on, the car remained close, matching my speed. Frank started to shift uneasily in his seat, and I could feel the tension growing. "You know that car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He shook his head, but I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. Minutes passed, and the car showed no sign of leaving. Then, out of nowhere, it sped up and overtook us, only to swerve in front and block the road ahead. My heart pounded as two men got out of the car, armed and ready for trouble. "Don't get out," I told Frank, but before I could say more, the passenger door flew open, and one of the men yanked Frank out of the seat. Another grabbed me, pulling me from behind the wheel. I struggled, but the cold steel of a gun pressed against my neck quickly convinced me to stop. They forced us into their car and sped off, leaving my RV stranded on the side of the road. I had no idea where they were taking us. Frank was pale, his hands trembling as we sat in the back seat, exchanging terrified glances. The men in the front didn't say a word, only exchanged nods as they drove deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The landscape became more isolated, fields, hills, and not a single soul in sight. My pulse was racing. Every instinct I had told me this wasn't going to end well. They eventually turned off the main highway, taking us down a narrow dirt road. My mind raced, trying to figure out some way to escape, but with guns at our backs, there was little we could do. The car came to a stop in a desolate area, far from any sign of life. The only sound was the wind howling across the open plains. They dragged us out and threw us to the ground. One of the men, a tall guy with a shaved head, pointed his gun at us. "You two had a bad day, didn't you?" he sneered, his voice cold and mocking. The other guy, stockier with a cruel smirk, kicked dirt in our faces. I could barely look up, my face pressed to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. Frank was shaking next to me, murmuring something under his breath, a prayer maybe. Then, the tall man raised his gun, and my entire body tensed. Was this it? Was this how it ended? I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. Bang! I flinched, waiting for the pain, waiting for my life to flash before my eyes. But nothing came. Slowly, I opened my eyes and saw the gunman grinning, the barrel pointed at the dirt just inches from my face. He had fired at the ground to scare us. "You're lucky," he said with a laugh, his breath reeking of alcohol. "It's your new birthday today. You're reborn, man." I didn't understand what he meant, but I was too shaken to care. The other guy joined in on the laughter, mocking us as we lay there, terrified and helpless. "Let's go," the taller man finally said, and with that, they hopped back into their car, leaving us lying in the dirt. The roar of their engine faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Frank and I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. We were too scared to even breathe, afraid they might return. After what seemed like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, we finally mustered the courage to sit up. The relief of being alive washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a deep, gnawing fear. We were in the middle of nowhere, no phone signal, no transportation, and the sun had completely set. "We need to get back to the road," Frank whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, helping him to his feet. We were both bruised and exhausted, but somehow we managed to trudge our way back to the highway, where we flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind older couple, gave us a ride to the nearest town, where we were finally able to call the police. When we arrived at the sheriff's office, we told them everything. How we had been kidnapped, how the men had threatened us, and how they had left us for dead. The sheriff took it seriously and sent out a patrol to search the area. My RV was found 2 miles from where we'd been dumped, abandoned but unharmed. Frank and I were shaken, but alive. The next morning, Frank and I parted ways. He had had enough and was taking a bus back home. As for me, I wanted to continue my journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of that gun, the twisted smile of the man who had toyed with our lives. Even now, years later, I think about that night. It changed me. I used to love the open road, the freedom of driving without a care in the world. But after what happened on Route 22, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if those men had decided not to let us go? That question will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, one last hurrah before life took over. Luke had recently graduated from college and, before starting his new job in Denver, he decided to take a solo drive from his home in Chicago to visit his old high school friends in Boulder, Colorado. The plan was straightforward: break the drive into a few days, explore some interesting spots, and enjoy the freedom of the open road. He'd always loved driving alone, the solitude offering him time to think, to reset. Luke had carefully planned his route, aiming to stop at small towns along the way, those forgotten places in the Midwest with quaint diners, antique shops, and the occasional roadside oddity. His first day went smoothly. The sun hung high in the sky as he cruised along the highway, his car windows down, music blaring. By late afternoon, he pulled into a small town on the outskirts of Iowa, stopped for some food, and refueled before continuing his journey. As night began to fall, the scenery grew increasingly barren. The highway stretched out ahead of him like an endless ribbon, cutting through wide, empty fields. The only lights came from the distant glow of far-off towns or the occasional flicker of a gas station. That's when the isolation hit him. He hadn't seen another car for miles. Luke decided it was time to find a place to rest for the night. Spotting a small, flickering neon sign in the distance, he pulled off the highway and into a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 1980s. It was a simple structure, 2 old gas pumps under a dimly lit awning, with a small convenience store attached. The area was deserted, save for an old pickup truck parked around the side. The place felt isolated, almost too quiet. Luke parked his car, stepped out, and stretched his legs. The chill of the night air prickled his skin, and he suddenly felt an odd unease creeping over him. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the eerie stillness. He filled up the gas tank and walked toward the store, the door creaking open as he stepped inside. The store was empty. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the shelves. A bored-looking cashier, an older man with a scruffy beard and a trucker cap, stood behind the counter, staring blankly at an old television that was playing some static-filled program. "Evening," Luke muttered as he made his way toward the back, grabbing a couple of snacks and a soda. When he returned to the counter, he noticed the man was now eyeing him intently. "Where you headed?" the cashier asked in a raspy voice, his gaze shifting between Luke and the dark highway outside. "Boulder," Luke replied, trying to sound casual. "Visiting some friends." The man gave a slow nod, but his expression remained unchanged. "You be careful out there," he muttered as he handed Luke his change. "Roads get strange at night." Luke forced a smile, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, thanks. Will do." He stepped back outside, the chilly air hitting him once more. As he made his way to his car, he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine. A black SUV had pulled into the lot, parking a few spaces away from his car. The windows were heavily tinted, too dark to see inside. Luke felt his pulse quicken. There hadn't been a car on the road for miles, and now, out of nowhere, this vehicle appeared? He got into his car quickly, trying to shake off the paranoia. Maybe someone else was just stopping for gas. No big deal. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He glanced at the SUV again. It remained still, its engine off, its windows dark. Luke put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, getting back onto the highway. A few minutes passed, and Luke began to relax again, convincing himself that he was being ridiculous. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw headlights in the rearview mirror. The SUV was behind him. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. His heart pounded as the SUV gained on him, its headlights growing larger, closer. Luke accelerated, hoping to lose it. But the SUV matched his speed, staying right on his tail. His palms grew slick with sweat as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Was this really happening? He'd heard stories, people being followed on highways, sometimes for miles. But this was something else. Every time Luke sped up, the SUV did the same. Every time he slowed down, so did the vehicle. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He quickly glanced at his phone. No service. The empty field stretched out on both sides of the road, offering no hope of escape. His GPS had lost signal, leaving him to navigate the deserted road on his own. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights flickered. It swerved slightly, as if the driver was playing with him. A wave of panic surged through Luke. His thoughts raced. Should he stop, try to confront them, or keep driving and hope they'd eventually give up? But then, the SUV swerved again, this time pulling into the other lane. Luke's heart raced. Was it trying to pass him? His question was answered when the SUV roared forward, pulling up alongside his car, matching his speed. Luke glanced to the side, but the windows were still too dark to see inside. And then it happened. The SUV veered sharply into Luke's lane, trying to force him off the road. Luke jerked the wheel to the right, barely avoiding a collision. His car swerved wildly, the tires screeching as he fought to maintain control. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing with terror. The SUV pulled back, falling in behind him once more. Luke was running out of options. He couldn't outrun them forever. His eyes scanned the dark horizon, looking for any sign of help. A town, a rest stop, another car. But there was nothing. And then, up ahead, he saw it. A small roadside diner, its neon sign glowing faintly in the night. Without thinking, Luke jerked the wheel and pulled off the highway, speeding into the diner's gravel lot. He came to a screeching stop near the entrance and threw the car into park. The SUV roared past on the highway, its engine howling as it disappeared into the night. Luke sat there, his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped, for now. He stumbled out of the car and rushed into the diner, his legs trembling with adrenaline. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone waitress behind the counter and an older man sitting in one of the booths. "Are you okay, hun?" the waitress asked, her eyes widening when she saw his pale face and wild expression. I think someone was trying to run me off the road," Luke stammered, still trying to catch his breath. He quickly explained what had happened, but as he spoke, he realized how insane it sounded. A black SUV with no visible driver chasing him down a deserted highway? Who would believe that? The waitress nodded slowly, her face grim. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "We've heard about things like this happening on these roads. Strange cars, strange people, always at night." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "People go missing sometimes," the waitress replied, glancing nervously out the window. "Cars vanish. Bodies are found miles away. No one knows why, but it's been happening for years. The police can never explain it." Luke swallowed hard, a sickening realization washing over him. He had narrowly escaped becoming one of those stories. For the rest of the night, Luke stayed at the diner, unable to bring himself to get back on the road. When morning finally came, he cautiously made his way to Boulder, driving in daylight, constantly checking his rearview mirror. He made it to his friend's house, but the trip had changed him. The carefree excitement of his road trip had been replaced by a lingering fear that stayed with him for months. Even after reporting the incident to the local authorities, who shrugged it off as a case of road rage, Luke knew that night on the empty highway was something far more sinister. He never drove those roads alone again.